Major Krug went into the cabin first, and he was inside for about 4 minutes, which does not sound like a long time unless you are 19 years old. Standing in the July sun on a ridge that is not on your map, holding a radio that has not been able to raise the base all morning, watching a plank door your commanding officer walked through and did not come back out of. And when Major Alva Krug did come out, friends, he came out backward. I want that on the record first, because it is the first thing in this account I saw with my own eyes and could not file anywhere in a 19-year-old's head. A decorated major of the United States Air Force, a man who had flown 30 missions over Europe before I was born, stepped backward out of a one-room surveyor's cabin, the way a man steps backward out of a horse stall, slow even, keeping his front to what he was leaving. And he stood in the grass a moment, squaring his breathing, and then he said, "To no one of us in particular, in a voice I will hear the rest of my days, Tandy, bring the tape. We are going to measure this thing," he said, "and we are going to measure it twice, because nobody in Washington is going to believe us even once." And we measured it, friends, with a government steel tape, in the presence of 6 sworn men, twice. The cabin of the missing survey party, outside, wall to wall, ran 19 feet and 4 inches on its long side. I held the dumb end of that tape myself, and then the sergeant carried the tape in through the door and stretched it along the same wall from inside, corner to corner, one room, no partitions, and I heard him call the number, and I heard the pencil stop, and I heard him call it again slower, like a man reading his own death sentence off a form, and the number from inside that one-room cabin, friends along the same wall, under the same roof, was 26 feet and 9 inches. Outside, 19.4. Inside, 26.9. That number is in an Air Force log, with a July 1959 date on it, initialed by every man on that ridge. And the log existed the last time I had standing to ask about it, in a records annex, behind a classification that has outlived every man who signed it but me. And the tape measurement, friends, God help me, the tape was the easy part. Because the whole time we were measuring, all of us kept our backs turned, by some silent common agreement of the animal brain, to the far left corner of that room, and to the thing in it that I am going to make myself describe for you before this account is over, the corner where Captain Nolan Weir had finished his map. Before we drive up that ridge together, do one small thing for an old radio man. Put in the comments where you are tonight, your town, your state, and whether the country around you lies flat and honest or folds. I read every one of them, and by the end of tonight, that word, folds, is going to mean something different to you than it means right now. My name is Roscoe Tandy. In 1959, I was an airman second class out of Ellsworth Air Force Base, east of Rapid City, South Dakota, 19 years old, a radio operator with a strong back and a clean driving record, which is how a boy ends up attached to things above his clearance. And what I want to explain first, so this account sits square for you, is why the United States Air Force was up in the Black Hills, with survey parties at all that summer, because that part is not spooky. Friends, that part is just the 20th century. It was the height of the Cold War. Ellsworth was a strategic air command base, the big bombers, and a bomber that flies low to duck radar needs something nobody had ever actually possessed before, which is a perfect map. Not a good map. Perfect. Every ridge, every draw, every knob of granite between here and the top of the world, charted to tolerances that would have made Lewis and Clark laugh out loud. And when the mapping program got down to brass tacks at the end of the 50s, the men running it discovered a thing that civilians never think about, friends, which is that this country our own country, still had holes in it. Dead zones, they called them, in the paperwork. Little polygons of ground, in the Mountain West mostly, where the old surveys disagreed with each other, where the triangulation from one century would not shake hands with the aerial photography of the next, where two perfectly good government maps, laid one on the other on a light table, showed the same creek in two places, or a ridge in one and a hollow in the other. Most of those holes were boring, friends. Sloppy chainwork in 1870-something, a benchmark heaved by frost, arithmetic. You sent a party in, they ran new lines, the hole closed, everybody went to lunch. That was the job. There was a whole summer program of it. In 59, small parties, a captain and 3 or 4 enlisted men, out in the hills for 2-week stretches, sewing up the holes in the map of America. Now the Black Hills themselves, friends, deserve a minute before I put the survey party into them. Because if you have never been, you are probably picturing them wrong. They are not a range, they are an island, a dark fist of granite and pine standing up alone out of 1,000 miles of grass. And they are old, older than the Rockies, older than the Appalachians, some of the oldest rock on this continent worn down to its hard heart. And everything about them is a little bit apart from the country around them. The weather is apart, they make their own clouds, the animals are apart, and the people were always apart about them too. Friends, the Lakota held those hills to be the center of everything. Not a place you lived, but a place you went. Carefully, for reasons. And the white men who poured in after the gold in 76 mostly did not stay high in them either. They worked their claims and built their towns in the gulches and came down. And if you go through the old county histories, the way I have gone through them, you find, every generation or so, in the fine print, a surveyor's complaint. 1881, a crew abandons a township survey, northwest of Deerfield. Reason of record, quote, persistent instrument error, unquote. 1907, a timber cruise comes back a week late, with a third of the block marked, quote, deferred, unquote. No reason of record at all. 1934, the CCC boys cut a fire road that the Forest Service maps of 1940 simply do not show, and the maps of 1950 show a different road in a different place with the same number. Nobody strings beads like that at the time, friends. You string them at a lamp 60 years later, when you know which block of hills every one of those complaints has its corner in. And the hole they gave to Captain Nolan Weir, friends, the polygon of Black Hills timber and granite, northwest of Deerfield, that the paperwork called simply Block 41, was, by every account I later heard, considered a plum. Pretty country. 2 weeks of pine air. The discrepancies in Block 41 were old and fat and obvious, the kind a good man clears in 10 days, and Nolan Weir was better than a good man. I never met him alive. Friends, let me say that plainly. Everything I know of the living Weir, I know from his file photograph, from the men who trained under him, and from a notebook I will get to in its place. But by all of it, he was the best military cartographer between the coasts. A lean, precise patient, captain of 38, who had charted coastline under fire in the Pacific, and thought, as one of his old sergeants told me at a reunion decades later, in contour lines the way musicians think in keys. His party went up into Block 41 on the 6th of July, 1959. Captain Weir, Sergeant Tolby Nations, and 3 enlisted men, whose names I am going to leave in the file, out of respect for families who got telegrams that said things the telegrams did not believe. Radio check-ins every evening at 1800. On the 9th of July, the evening check-in was 1 word long. Weir's own voice, they said, calm as a dial tone. He keyed the handset, and he said, recalculating. And that was the last transmission the United States Air Force ever received from Block 41. Friends, one word, a cartographer's word, recalculating, and the 6 days that followed it, and what we drove up that mountain and found at the end of them, are the rest of this account. 6 days is a long time to lose 5 airmen inside the continental United States, and I want to walk you through those days properly, because the file makes them sound orderly, and they were not. The 10th of July was procedure. Weather was blamed. A repeater was blamed. Nobody drove anywhere. The 11th, a spotter plane flew Block 41 twice and reported, and this is a quote I copied into my own notebook years later, when I had one privileged hour with the incident file. Quote, party base camp located and appears in order. Vehicles present. No personnel visible. No distress signals displayed. In order. Friends. Tents standing. Truck parked. And 5 men gone quiet. In country you could walk out of in a day and a half in any direction. The 12th, they flew it again. And this time the report reads different. And you can feel, even through the flat military language, a pilot picking his words the way a man picks his footing. Quote, observer notes apparent discrepancy in ridge configuration northwest of camp, relative to current chart. Recommend ground verification. Apparent discrepancy in ridge configuration. A ridge, friends, where the map did not have one, and the map was 3 months old, and the aerial photography under that map was newer than that. And on the same day, and this is the part that got the recovery rolling with a major at its head instead of a sergeant, Lieutenant Pearsall, a radar officer at Ellsworth, filed his anomaly report. Pearsall ran one of the search radars, and radar men in those years knew all about false returns. Angels, they called them. Flocks of birds, temperature inversions, ghosts of the equipment itself. But Pearsall's angel, friends, sat still. 3 nights running, the same faint return, up in the hills, in the Block 41 quadrant, at a constant bearing, at a constant range, painting on the scope like a structure. Like a tower, he told the board later, or a mast, something with hard vertical geometry to it, in timber country, where the chart showed nothing taller than a fire lookout 30 miles south. And here is the sentence from his report that I have carried for 67 years, friends. Quote, the return exhibited no motion, but successive sweeps indicated minor variation in apparent range, as though the reflecting object, while stationary, were not maintaining a constant distance. Sit with that the way the board would not. Stationary, but not at a constant distance. So on the 13th of July, before light, the recovery party went up. Major Alva Krug, commanding, a flight surgeon, a photographer, 2 security policemen, Sergeant Dale, myself on the radio, 2 vehicles. And I will give you the drive, friends, because the drive was the first lesson. Block 41 is not deep wilderness, understand? It is the Black Hills, old mining country, logging country. There are roads. We had the party's own route overlay, their marked turns. And from the highway to their base camp should have been an hour and 40 minutes. And it took us most of 5 hours, and at no single moment could any man in either vehicle have told you exactly how we were losing the time. The road forked where the overlay showed no fork, and both forks bent back together a mile on, sheepish, like nothing had happened. A creek the overlay had on our left ran on our right for 20 minutes. Friends, I watched it do it, and then it was on our left again, and I could not name the moment it crossed. Twice Major Krug halted the convoy, got out with the compass, shot a bearing on a granite knob, walked 30 steps, shot it again, and stood there longer than any officer likes to be seen standing, because the two bearings did not agree with each other by more degrees than 30 steps can explain. Friends? And the compass was not broken. We checked it against a second compass, and the two compasses agreed with each other perfectly. They just did not agree with the country. And I remember, on the last stretch, standing up through the hatch with the radio whip, bent under the pine limbs, looking out at that pretty, sunny, absolutely quiet timber, and having, for the first time in my 19 years, the thought that has organized my whole long life since, friends. I had grown up believing the land is the thing that holds still, and everything else moves across it. That is what a map is. That is the whole promise of a map. And that country, that afternoon, was not holding still. It was very close to holding still, friends. The way a man in a game of statues is very close to holding still. It held still whenever we looked at it. It was the corners of the eyes where the world had gone loose. The base camp of the survey party, when we finally rolled into it at 1 in the afternoon, was exactly what the spotter plane had promised. And I have stood in some quiet places in my life, and none of them have been quiet the way that camp was quiet. 3 wall tents, taut. The truck, parked, keys in it, batteries live, cots made. Sergeant Nation's pipe sitting on a folding table with burned tobacco still in the bowl, gone over with dew and dust. A wash line with 2 shirts on it, and both shirts, friends. I noticed it and said nothing for 30 years. Both shirts were dry on the line in the sun, but pegged at the shoulder and the tail, 4 pegs each, tight the way you would peg a shirt down if you were afraid of it being taken. And no man pegs a shirt like that. And the instruments, friends? I have saved the instruments, because for my money, they are the loudest thing that camp said. A survey party lives by its instruments, the way my trade lived by the radio, and Weirs were the best the government owned, and they were all present, all cased, all cared for, except the main theodolite, the sighting instrument, the party's one precious eye, and that stood outside. Friends, 50 yards up the slope from the tents, set up in working position on its tripod, leveled, and a theodolite is leveled over a point. Understand, a benchmark, a driven pin, a station, a man has measured and marked, and means to measure from. We walked up to it through the grass, the sergeant and I, and it stood there perfect as a soldier, bubble dead center, dust on the eyepiece, and under it, friends, under the plumb of that patient instrument, there was nothing. No pin, no stake, no scratched stone, no mark of any kind, undisturbed grass and pine duff. And the sergeant crouched under the tripod a long time, with his hands on his knees, not touching anything. And then he said, in the voice men use in church, whether they mean to or not, it is set up over a station, Tandy. Everything about it says station. And I said, there is nothing there, Sergeant. And he stood up and dusted his knees and looked at the grass, and he said the sentence that I did not understand for years and now cannot stop understanding. He said, not anymore there ain't. The field notes in the map tent ran, neat as print, through the evening of the 9th. The last page of camp notes was in Captain Weir's hand, and it was not neat. It was one line, written large, and it said, moved my working papers up to the old cabin, better light and friends. There were 2 things wrong with that sentence, and the second one took a minute to land on me. The first was, there was no cabin on any chart of Block 41. And the second was, the sentence said, better light. Nolan Weir wrote that line, by the field note's own sequence. After dark on the 9th of July, friends. After dark, better light. And Major Krug read that page twice standing in the tent door, and folded it into his case, and looked northwest up the slope, where the timber climbed toward the ridge the spotter pilot had not liked, the ridge with the discrepancy, and gave the only order there was to give. And we left the trucks and went up on foot into Block 41, 7 men in a file, toward a cabin that was not on the map, on a ridge that was not on the map either, following, though not one of us would have said it out loud, friends, the only landmark that had stayed put for 4 days. Lieutenant Pearsall's Angel, the return that stood still without keeping its distance. The ridge took us 2 hours that should have been 40 minutes, and I will not spend your evening on the ways the ground misbehaved, because you have the idea now, the fork that healed, the creek that switched banks, all of it gentler up there and therefore worse, and I will bring you straight to the top, to the moment the file calls initial visual contact with unrecorded structure. The cabin sat in a saddle of the ridge in open grass, and it was old. Friends. That was the first surprise. Log-built, gray as a wasp nest, a pre-statehood prospector's cabin by its bones, roof sway-backed, 1 window, 1 door, 100 years of Dakota weather on it, standing in country the government had surveyed, photographed from the air, and flown over for decades, and no record of it existing anywhere. And I want to describe what it was like to look at, because the photographer tried all afternoon to make his camera do it, and his camera would not. It was not that the cabin looked wrong, friends. Piece by piece, it looked completely right. Every log, every axe mark, every shake on the roof, right? It was that it would not add up into a building while you watched. The long wall and the short wall met at the corner the way walls do, and your eye ran the corner, and somewhere in the running, your eye came away, knowing the angle had not been square and not been anything else either. The photographer, a sergeant with 20 years of aerial and evidence work, shot 2 rolls of the exterior, bracketed, steady, from marked positions, and when they were developed back at Ellsworth, friends, every frame was in focus, and not one frame agreed with another about the shape of that building. There is a memorandum in the file from the photo lab, 1 paragraph, that ends with a sentence I heard read aloud once at the board. Quote, "It is the opinion of this section that the variance is not attributable to equipment, processing, or operator error." End quote. And there the opinion of that section stops, friends, because the only sentence that could follow that one is not a sentence a photo lab is allowed to write. If this is your first night at this lamp, here is where I pull over for half a minute, and then we are going through that door together. This channel is one old man, and the accounts that never fit the file drawer, told plain and level. No music pushing at you. No pictures jumping out, just the lamp and the truth as close as I can carry it. If that is worth your evening, subscribe so the next account finds you. And when you finish tonight, take down any map you keep in the house, a road atlas, a trail map, anything, and look at your own home country on it for 1 quiet minute and be thankful, friends. Be thankful it agrees to be drawn. Krug went in first, as I told you at the start, and came out backward, and sent me for the tape, and we did the measuring. 19.4 outside, 26.9 inside, twice initialed, and I have had 67 years to think about how to say what the inside of that cabin was, and I am going to say it the way it actually came at me, which was in 3 waves. The first wave was ordinary. A table, a stool, a lamp, a bedroll, shelves, a working room. The second wave was the paper. Every wall, friends, every vertical surface of that room was papered with charts, pinned shoulder to shoulder, floor to rafters, dozens of them, and more on the table in drifts. and they were beautiful. I have to say that plainly. Drawn in Weir's hand, in government ink, with all the discipline of the finest work, of the finest military cartographer between the coasts. And they were charts of the Black Hills. You could read the country in them. Block 41, our own ridge, the saddle, the cabin marked as a small true square. And they were wrong, friends. Wrong in a way I did not have eyes for at 19, and have spent a lifetime growing the eyes to describe. Contour lines that closed on themselves twice. Two peaks occupying the same ground at different, I want to say directions. And that is not the right word, and there is no right word. That is the point. A drainage drawn, flowing out of the map sheet, and back into it from the margin, with the margin annotated in Weir's tiny neat capitals. This edge is not an edge. Elevation figures that climbed as the lines fell. A compass rose in the corner of the largest sheet, with 5 cardinal points on it. Friends. 5. Drawn by a man who had drawn 10,000 compass roses, and under it, in the same steady hand, the notation: true north, magnetic north, grid north, local north, and see notebook. And the third wave, friends, the one that emptied that cabin of us in, under a minute the first time, was when the flight surgeon, standing at the big wall chart, the master sheet, said, quietly, to Major Krug, "Sir, this chart shows the door in the east wall." And we all looked at the chart, where the little true square of the cabin had its door drawn plainly on its east side. And then we all looked at the door we had come in through. Friends, in the south wall, sunlight lying through it on the floorboards. And while we looked, I will testify to this on anything you hold out to me. Nobody moved, nobody spoke, and the sunlight on the floor lay there exactly as it had. And yet, every man in that room became aware at the same moment, by the same door hinge creak of the animal brain, that the light was now coming from the east, that the door was in the east wall, that it had, in some fashion, no eye had caught and no camera would back up, always been in the east wall, and the chart had simply been finished before we were. Krug got us out, formed us up in the grass, and we stood there breathing, while he looked at his watch a long time. And what he said next is why I followed that man's coffin in 1981, with my hat over my heart. He did not say what a frightened man says, He said, "Gentlemen, the structure is consistent with the captain's survey. We will proceed on the assumption that Captain Weir's papers are accurate, and the assumption that our own eyes are approximate. 2-man rule inside, 10 minutes by the watch, log everything. Tandy, you are timekeeper." And then it was 1500 hours, friends, and the light was going long and gold on the grass of the saddle, and Major Krug and the flight surgeon went back through the east door with the second notebook, the fresh one, to log the table and the papers on it properly. And that, friends, is when they found what I have been keeping to the far side of this part all evening. The way we all kept our backs to it that afternoon. The corner. Captain Nolan Weir had not left his cabin. Captain Nolan Weir was still at his work, and had been, the surgeon would come to believe, since some hour of the 10th of July, and I am going to tell you about the far left corner of the impossible cabin in the next part of this account, when I have had this pause to get my voice level, because you have trusted me this far, friends, and that corner is owed to you plain, and plain is the hardest way there is to tell it. The corner of the cabin, the far left as you came in by the door that was now east, held a drafting board, homemade, a wide plank set on 2 flour barrels, and a stool, and light from the window fell on it the way light falls in the old paintings, and the board carried 1 chart, the last chart, pinned at 3 corners, and Captain Nolan Weir was seated at the board on the stool, at his work, pen in hand, and he had been dead, by the flight surgeon's best judgment, between 3 and 4 days. And friends, I have promised you plain, so here is plain, and here also is where I keep faith with the men in that room, by saying only what the addendum says, and what my own eyes carry, and not one syllable of dressing on it. He was calcified. That is the surgeon's word, in the addendum, in his handwriting. Not decayed, not mummified, calcified, the flesh gone the color, and, where the surgeon touched it once with a steel probe, the sound of limestone, of caliche, of something quarried, a man of stone in service dress at a drafting board. And the stillness of him was not the stillness of the dead. Friends, I have sat with the dead since. The dead are absent, and Captain Weir was not absent. Captain Weir was attentive. His head was bent to the chart in the fullest concentration I have ever seen on a human face. And I looked at that face for a total of perhaps 8 seconds across 2 entries into that cabin. And what was on it was not pain and was not fear. It was the face of a craftsman, at the exact center of his craft, and I would call it peace if peace were not such a soft word for something that had that much pressure behind it. And the addendum's central finding, the sentence that went up the chain in a sealed envelope, and I believe ended whatever career that honest surgeon might have had, is this, and I quote it exact, friends, because I read it once under a lamp with my own eyes. The remains cannot be considered separable from the structure. Ossification is continuous at every point of contact, through the stool, into the floor planking, and, at the left hand, into the document itself. There is no seam. It is the opinion of the examining officer that separation would require quarrying, and that the term remains may itself be imprecise, as the process appears to have been, at the time of death, incomplete in the direction of the subject, and complete in the direction of the floor. Incomplete in the direction of the subject, friends, and complete in the direction of the floor. A military doctor wrote that sentence in July of 1959, and then had to live with having written it. And I have had to live with having read it. And the plainest translation I can give you, after 67 years, is the one the sergeant gave, standing in the grass that evening, with his hat in his hands, because nobody had told him to take his hat off, and he had taken it off. He looks like a statue nobody finished carving out, the sergeant said, like the stone is still deciding. And the left hand, friends, I owe you the left hand. Weir's right hand held the pen, above the chart, an inch above it, arrested. His left hand lay flat on the sheet, holding it, the way every draftsman's left hand has held every sheet since drafting began, and where the fingers of the left hand lay on the paper, they did not end, friends. They continued. The lines of the hand ran off the fingertips into the lines of the chart, knuckle into ridgeline, tendon into drainage, the border between flesh and paper drawn over, redrawn, blended by a better draftsman than either. And his index finger, I measured it with my eyes 8 seconds at a time, and the photo section later measured it with instruments and got the same answer. His index finger was the 121st contour line of the peak he had been drawing. Friends, it lay along it. It lay as it. Elevation notated in his own hand on his own hand. And the peak that finger traced, the last peak on the last chart of Captain Nolan Weir, does not exist in the Black Hills of South Dakota. And I want to be exact with you even here, especially here. It does not exist yet. That is what the chart felt like. Friends, standing in that gold window light looking at it. Not a record, a draft. Not a map of what the country was. A working drawing of what the country was being revised toward, and the captain had not been killed by it. That word has no purchase. In that corner, the captain had been incorporated, the way a good survey incorporates a benchmark. And on the margin of that final sheet, in the small neat capitals of the sanest hand that ever ruined itself on an impossible job, was the last full sentence Nolan Weir ever wrote. And the file quotes it, and so will I. I have found the projection. It is not the land that is wrong. It is north. And under that, lower, smaller, the pen visibly slowing, 4 words more. Local north is downhill. They did not bring him out, friends. You understand now why the addendum said it. Separation would require quarrying, and no man in that saddle, from the major down to the 19-year-old on the radio, believed for 1 minute that the quarrying would have stopped at the captain, or that anything cut free of that floor would have consented to stay cut free. And I will not pretend a cool military calculus made that decision. I stood there. It was made the way you take your hand off a hot stove. What came out of the cabin came out in one canvas map case, carried by Major Krug personally, and it held 2 items only. The field notebook from the table, the little green government notebook, where a great cartographer had written down, day by day and then hour by hour, in language that started as trigonometry and ended as scripture, what it is like to measure ground that measures back, and 1 chart. Not the last one. Friends, nobody proposed touching the last one. An earlier sheet, the 5-pointed compass rose sheet, taken as evidence because the board would need something, and I carried the radio down that ridge in front of Major Krug in the blue dark. And the descent took 40 minutes, friends. The descent took exactly what the map said it should take, and every fork held, and every creek stayed on its bank. And that was somehow the worst thing yet, because it felt, in the whole file of my body agreed, like a door being held open, politely, for guests the house was done with. We reached the trucks at full dark. Behind and above us, on the ridge that was not on the map, the saddle stood against the stars, and in it, in a cabin with its door in whichever wall it wanted, a patient man of stone sat at his board in the dark, pen an inch off the paper, waiting on the country to hold a pose. And as far as any human record shows, friends, he had 2 more nights of that work left before the Air Force gave him his cremation. 48 hours after Major Krug's report went up the chain, on the 16th of July, 1959, 2 aircraft out of Ellsworth flew a training sortie over the empty middle of the Black Hills. And if you go to the microfilm of the Rapid City paper for that week, you will find 3 lines about it. A scheduled exercise, ordnance expended on an uninhabited government tract, smoke visible from Deerfield, no cause for public concern. I was not on that ridge, friends. No ground party was. There was never going to be a ground party again, but I was on the base, and I watched the aircraft go out heavy in the morning and come back light in the afternoon, and I stood by the fence with my cap in my hand, the way the sergeant had stood in the saddle, and that evening, the Block 41 incident acquired the only official shape it would ever have. A survey party lost to a flash fire in steep terrain. 5 names on 1 stone in the National Cemetery outside Sturgis. Friends, you can visit it. I have, every July for 60 years, and 4 of those men are under no stone anywhere, because they were never found. Not on the ridge, not in the drainages, not that summer, not since. And the 5th man, the captain, is not under it either, friends. And where the 5th man is a question I have chosen, for my own remaining nights, to leave exactly where the napalm left it. The paperwork was gathered the way you have heard paperwork gathered in my other accounts, but this was Strategic Air Command. In '59, friends, They did not send polite, tired men in gray suits. The file simply rose, like water finding its level, up through classifications until no one either of us will ever meet could read it. And every man on that recovery party signed his page and was reassigned by Christmas, scattered, I have come to believe deliberately, to the four ordinary corners of the service. And the Air Force kept it secret the way institutions keep secrets. Friends, not by locking them up, by making them useless. Who do you tell when the truth is that a room outmeasured its own walls, that a door changed walls without moving, that the best map hand in the service is 120 contour lines deep in a peak that is not finished being real? You tell your wife once, past midnight in 1964, and she holds your hand and believes that you believe it, friends. And that is the very best you will ever get the side of a lamp and a listening dark. The men. Major Alva Krug served on, retired a colonel, and never, in 22 years of Christmas cards in his own upright hand, mentioned Block 41 but once. The last card, 1980, when the cancer had him. One line under the greeting, quote, I still say we measured true, Tandy. It was the ground that lied, unquote. And he died that spring, and I followed the coffin. Lieutenant Pearsall did 30 years in radar and air defense, and I sat with him at a reunion in Omaha in the 1990s. Two old men over weak coffee, and I asked him the question I had saved, whether his angel, the return that stood still without keeping its distance, had ever painted on a scope of his again. And Pearsall looked into his cup a while, friends, and then he said, only once. March of 62, High Plains site, different state entire, same signature, stationary, range oscillating. He said, I logged it as anomalous propagation, Roscoe, and I turned the scope filter up until it went away, and I have been ashamed of that knob my whole life. And the flight surgeon, friends, the man who wrote incomplete in the direction of the subject, left the service inside 2 years and practiced small-town medicine in Nebraska until he was 90. And the one time I visited him, an old man myself by then, he received me kindly, and we talked weather and grandchildren. And at the door, with my hat already on, he said the only sentence either of us had driven 300 miles for. He said, Tandy, I have delivered 400 babies since, and I want you to know the arithmetic came out favorable. And I said, favorable how, Doc? And he said every one of them was separable from the world, son. Every single one. Drive safe. As for me, friends, I will give you my own residue plane, and then the rule, and then the lamp is yours. I never made a map again. That sounds small. I was a radio man. Maps were not my trade, but I mean something under the trade. To this day, friends, I cannot draw you the route to that ridge. I have tried, maybe 30 times across 60 years, always in daylight, always with coffee. A plain pencil sketch of roads I drove twice in a government truck. And the pencil goes fine through the highway and the first turns. And then, at about where the fork healed itself, my hand goes wrong. Friends, not shaky. Wrong. The line comes out longer than I sent it, or it meets itself, and I set the pencil down and go do something with my hands in the shop. And my wife, 49 years, God rest her, learned to hear that particular pencil stop through 2 closed doors. And 2 summers ago, my grandson, who has the whole earth in his telephone, satellites, photographs, every acre of the Black Hills, sharp enough to count the pine cones, sat at my kitchen table, and I asked him, casual as an old fool can manage, to show me the country northwest of Deerfield. And he flew his little blue map up there, happy as you please. And northwest of Deerfield, friends, his telephone stuttered, The photograph tiles hung and loaded and hung in one polygon of hills, only the one, and the little blue arrow that says where you are. When he dragged his thumb across that block, swung friends, lazily, all the way around, like a compass over a magnet, or like a needle. God forgive me for knowing the difference now, over 5 norths, and my grandson laughed and said, "Dead zone, Grandpa, no coverage," and slapped his phone against his palm, and I looked at that spinning arrow, friends, and I heard a calm voice on a dead radio net, 67 years gone, say it's one word, recalculating, and I got up and poured the boy more milk. So here is your rule, friends, from the last man of the Block 41 recovery, and it is a surveyor's rule, but you will find, if you carry it a while, that it fits more country than land. If ever your lines will not close, if the bearings disagree while the compasses agree, if the trail has a fork, the map lacks, and the map is good, stop, put the pencil down. Do not correct the map to fit the ground, friends. That is the door. That is the exact hinge of the door. Nolan Weir was the best there ever was, and his whole undoing was that he was too fine a craftsman to let a wrong ridge stay undrawn. Trust the old map, the boring map, the map that agrees to hold still and walk out by it, even where it seems to lie, especially where it seems to lie. And once you are out, and this is the whole of it, friends, let the blank spot stay blank. The map makers of the old world wrote monsters in the margins. Here be dragons, and we laughed at them from our satellites. And I am 86 years old, and I have stood in a saddle in the Black Hills that is not on your telephone. And I will tell you what I think those old draftsmen knew. The dragons were never a warning about what lives in the blank places, friends. They were a courtesy to it. Some ground pays the courtesy back and holds still and lets itself be drawn. And some ground is still deciding. Put in the comments tonight the name of the blank spot in your own home country. The block the old folks root around, every county has one. I keep the list the way I once kept a radio log. Thank you for standing the watch with an old airman. Check your bearings twice on the way to bed. And leave a light on, friends. Local north is downhill. Good night.